Good afternoon. I'm calling to order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. I'm joined today by Council Members Fry, Council President Johnson, and Councilmember Andrew Johnson. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I'm the chair of this committee, and together we are a quorum of the committee. We have one item on our agenda for today. It's a discussion item, and it is an update to our federal legislative agenda. Or federal agenda, I guess is probably what it should say. And so I will turn, I think, to Mr. Ranieri to tee us off and let us know who all will be any speakers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Gene Ranieri. I'm Director of Government Relations for the City of Minneapolis. Today we will starting a discussion of our federal agenda. We do that every couple of years. This year it's been a challenge because of many of the changing policies of the current administration. The process we followed was we sat down with all the city departments, went over what we did in 2015, and asked them to review and comment back to us on 2017. Also talking to committee members and others, came up with some ideas and concepts dealing with the current administration, how to deal with the current administration.
And for just a second here, I'm just going to say to Mike in the sound booth, the mics sound, it's nothing to do with where you have them positioned, Gene.
Okay.
The mics sound really loud, and so in the reverberating. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so Peter Ebnet is going to be speaking to the agenda. We're here to answer questions, and we do have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. And at the end, we can talk a little bit more about the legislative process, where we are in that, and also some issues dealing with the Met Council.
Chair Glidden, committee members, as Gene mentioned, one of the reasons that we wanted to look at updating the federal agenda is given the new administration as well as the new Congress. And so we've done a great deal of review of the former agenda, and with working with stakeholders and with our sister departments have come up with what is before you today. The document is fairly long, and so I'll just be highlighting some either new or significant items within the agenda, but we're happy to stand for any questions as they come up. For each of the slides, there'll be a page number, so if you want to follow along. The first issue is healthcare. The administration has tried numerous times over the past year to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. They've been unsuccessful so far, and there is hope that there can be a bipartisan solution moving forward. In general, though, the city of Minneapolis supports a healthcare policy that ensures healthcare for all Americans, especially those with low income or other vulnerable populations. We also oppose efforts to dismantle the ACA and especially cuts to Medicaid. Over 27,000 Minneapolis residents have been able to obtain health coverage through the Medicaid expansion, and that was made possible by the ACA. We also oppose efforts to reduce funding for Planned Parenthood and other funding for women's health that are under attack at the federal level. The next issue is immigration reform. As you know,
Hang on, Mr.
Sure.
Ebnet. We have a question from Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Ebnet, and I apologize for interrupting, and I thought of this after we had our meeting, and I remember when Congressman Ellison was in talking about this teen pregnancy prevention dollars that were at risk from the federal government, and I think we might want to call that out in our narrative, just because that's been a huge success, and we want to see it keep going. Thank you.
Okay, great. We will add that in.
And I might note that there may be some things that we discuss in the committee, and especially if they're in background, I don't know if we need a formal motion on it, and we'll just kind of take notes of that. And if there is a need, then I'll bring a slightly updated version to the full council meeting. If there's something more significant that we need to vote on, we can do that if it's an amendment to the proposal.
Okay. Immigration reform is next. As you know, the administration has been active in attempting to block or repeal recent immigration reforms, most recently DACA. The city of Minneapolis supports comprehensive immigration reform that would provide a roadmap for permanent citizenship for approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants. Economists generally agree about the need for such a measure, but we also need the reform as a moral and ethical imperative. Protecting neighbors, coworkers, friends is essential to the city of Minneapolis. Additionally, the city supports the continuation of the DACA program and opposes efforts to build a border wall. Next up is the Resettlement of Refugees. Similar to immigration reform, we support continued resettlement of refugees and oppose efforts to limit these programs. Vetting as it exists now currently takes between 18 and 24 months and is extremely rigorous. As a city that's been enriched thanks to the presence of our refugee residents, we oppose efforts to unduly slow or stop resettlement, especially when based on unconstitutional metrics like religion, ethnicity, or national origin. Substance abuse and the mental health treatment for mental health disorders is something that's was similar to what we had in the 2015 version of the agenda. The city supports increased funding for preventative treatment for substance abuse and mental health disorders. The city also supports research and funding to combat the opioid epidemic that's facing the nation. Family and early childhood and adolescent health is also similar to as it existed on the 2015 agenda. This is one area, Council President Johnson, that we do include the teen pregnancy portion. The city supports continued funding for public health programs. A 20-year time horizon when analyzing public health programs is essential to ensure that long-term costs and benefits are correctly calculated. The youth violence prevention portion indicates support for designating youth violence as a national priority and as a preventable public health issue. Again, focusing on prevention is the most effective model here, and utilizing community-oriented policing to address the issue is what the city supports. New to our agenda is a position on the federal minimum wage. The city passed municipal minimum wage, recognizing it as imperative for our residents. The federal government hasn't addressed minimum wage since 2008, and with rising prices impacting low-income residents most significantly, raising and standardizing the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour is important. Most of the inclusive employment and non-discrimination in the workplace is similar again to 2015. The city supports legislation that bars employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, and supports putting President Obama's 2014 executive order into law. Additionally, the city opposes efforts to ban transgender service members from the United States military. Access to voting and the modernization of the election process and ensuring its integrity is not new, but there is added importance. The city supports legislation to increase voter participation in general. The city supports amending the Voting Rights Act to include more current measures of racial discrimination in voting. And additionally, the city supports efforts to fund updates to our aging voting infrastructure, both making voting accessible and to prevent disruption from outside entities. Finally, the city opposes efforts to supplant the Election Assistance Commission and supports efforts to provide certification of new voting equipment, especially ones that support ranked choice voting. Transparency in election financing is another key priority. The city supports transparency measures that ensure residents know who is funding elections. Unfortunately, with the new administration comes new threats to the openness of the internet. The city supports robust net neutrality rules, which ensure the residents have access to all content of the internet regardless of their source. The city also supports privacy and consumer protections on the internet to safeguard our residents. The city of Minneapolis opposes efforts by the federal government to preempt local public policy safety policy. Local public safety is put in peril when officers are required to act as immigration enforcement agents, and this puts all residents at risk. We also support federal funding for police training, including de-escalation, mental health training, and community policing needs. And we look to the federal government to be a partner in addressing issues that have plagued our police department as well as those across the country. The city opposes efforts to make it easier to obtain firearms. We support changing federal policy, which prevents the Center for Disease Control to study gun violence. The city supports funding and training for law enforcement to combat the sexual exploitation of youth, and believe that this funding should go towards working with youth and advocates to support rather than punish victims. The city of Minneapolis has a vibrant art scene, and while the city doesn't receive funds directly from the federal government, we recognize the important economic and social benefits provided to local communities through the support of federal arts and culture programming. The city, like many across the nation, is facing a housing crisis. We support protecting and enhancing the federal tax code provisions related to low-income housing tax credits and tax-exempt bonds. Additionally, we support providing increased funding for public housing capital improvements and the development of new public housing units. We also support funding to preserve naturally occurring public housing. Similarly, the city supports preserving and increasing funding for the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Federal Home Program, which are catalysts for creating more affordable housing in the city. The city supports federal infrastructure funding and recognizes the critical role that funding plays in attracting private investment, and that robust federal investment must be included in any infrastructure package. The city opposes some of the proposed shifts in the financial burden to municipal jurisdictions. And the city also supports greater investment from community in the community to participate in infrastructure decisions and efforts to redress past instances where that infrastructure decision has been a destructive force in the community. With the 2020 census coming up, the city supports adequately funding the 2020 census and ensure that it is completed an accurate count of the nation's population. The city also utilizes the American Community Survey significantly with many of our programs, and so the city supports continued funding of the American Community Survey. The city supports the use of science in decision-making and supports fully funding agencies whose role it is to oversee and protect the environment. And knowing that climate change is a worsening crisis for the state and for our world, we support honoring the Paris Climate Accord and support funding clean energy resources. The city opposes cuts to critical programs like SNAP and TFAP. As the city produces more food through urban agriculture, We also support efforts to fund programs and research around that work. The city supports collaboration between the FAA and local jurisdictions and oppose efforts to privatize the FAA, which would exacerbate the disconnection between airports and communities that are adjacent to them. The city supports continued funding for terrorism readiness programs and opposes efforts to shift that cost burden to local municipalities.
So I'm going to make a couple comments on this. I'm not sure if I've seen, this is before you get to kind of the money part, I guess. Just there's a couple places in here, just in general, I think that we can't be afraid to use the word race in our policy priorities, especially if that is really kind of the importance of some of the underlying work, is that what we're hearing from experts working on this issue is you need to target efforts and be kind of more direct and kind of calling out what you are hoping to do. So I might work with staff on what might be some ways to just ensure either our narrative. I'll tell you the two sections I'm thinking of in particular. One is the piece on what did they title it? Public safety and the role of local law enforcement. So I think that's a really particularly important one, where we're doing a lot of important reform work in the city of Minneapolis to train our officers. I mean, we're really investing in this, but this is also something where the federal government needs to know that it's critical for them to support efforts to work on issues of addressing bias in policing, ensuring that we have trust within all communities, whereas today trust within communities of color is is plummeting. So kind of I think we just cannot be afraid to use the word race and how we're trying to strategize and target certain initiatives to ensure communities of color are well served by our public services. The second place would be in the affordable housing and workforce housing section. Again, and most of this policy work in the main is impacting communities of color. And so we have to be able to use words that indicate what we really are saying about the importance of the work. So we'll just work on kind of interspersing that a little bit. But I wanted to call that out. I'm not seeing other comments from council members. So maybe Jean, would you like, or Mr. Ranieri, would you like to continue with the federal awards to Minneapolis?
Yes, Madam Chair. The chart up here really shows what's happening with federal relationships fiscally with the nation's cities and local governments. The big bump in 2011, the first year, is really the result of the Recovery Act from President Obama's administration in 2009, 2010. Then you see a sort of steady then a drop in federal funding through 2016. That's many of those are continuations of continuing resolutions. We haven't had a budget or an appropriations process approved by Congress for about 4 or 5 years. So you see, and we were projecting for the future, is these funds basically to stay about the same. And we're spending most of our time when it comes to appropriations defending what we have, because there's a movement to move away from funding to cities and more into defense. So lots of proposals for defense and less for non-discretionary funding. So we are, in much of the document, we're talking about at least no less than 2017. In terms of specific things that are being talked about in Washington, one is the whole issue of the infrastructure package. We don't know exactly what's in that package. We do have some recommendations that that package basically include federal funding too. There's been some discussion, maybe it'd be public, meaning local and state, and private, and there has to be continuation of federal. On the other issue here is also on the general fund, One of the issues here is there's going to be some proposals for tax reform. Yesterday, the president outlined his outline for tax reform. A lot of it deals with, at least it's public right now, is on individual income tax, corporate income tax, things of that nature. Little discussion about some of the exemptions, particularly the exemption for tax-exempt bonds. Will that continue? We're urging and recommending continuation of those. For example, in our own city, our capital improvement program relies on the issuance of tax-exempt bonds to be used for our improvements. And if that ability goes away, we're not certain what the rates would be. Because if at the same time it becomes less advantageous to invest in those kinds of bonds, what does happen to that market? Does all of a sudden the rates go up? That's a major issue for us. Another issue is something that's been around for years, and that's trying to raise, giving the states the ability to have a sales tax on goods that are purchased electronically. It's the so-called Main Street tax, because there's a issue. The Supreme Court said if you have a location in where the taxing jurisdiction is located, be it a factory, a warehouse, a distribution center, then you could do a tax. We here in Minnesota, we're seeing that Amazon and others are now locating in our state, and they are paying sales tax. However, there are other companies who are not located in our state who aren't, and that issue is in front of Congress. It may wind up in an omnibus bill. I don't know. There has been bipartisan support, but it has not been passed. So that's another major. Now, what does that mean for Minnesota? A couple of years ago, the Commissioner of Revenue thought it could be a couple $100 million a year additional revenue, but that was before Amazon located in our state. Madam Chair, recommendations are basically continuation of funding. We'd like to see more funds go to federal non-discretionary rather than defense, and also taking care of some of the tax exemptions we have. We can stand for more questions.
So I'm looking in here, and I will say you've got a lot on the agenda, and it might be just my eyes are not going to this, but I don't see a clear section where we talk about the importance of maintaining funding for community development block grants. And so we really need a very clear statement of that. Again, it might be in here, and my eyeballs are not going to it. But I would think it should go in the section where we start talking about appropriations. I do not think it should be part of the housing section, because we do not, in fact, want to restrict ourselves to using it for housing. The point of it is the broad-based program, and we're using it very well, prioritizing housing. So,
Madam Chair, we did take your advice, but maybe we didn't hit the mark right. But we're on page 14.
Okay.
We have a whole section on community development programs, and we do strongly ask for the preserved continuation of funding for CDBG. And it's separate from housing.
All right, great. Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Ranierian, you're talking about the issues that we're watching in this tax bill, the municipal bond tax exemption or whatever. We also looking at, we're in a high property tax state. So are we looking at and I don't know if it's in there or not. I mean, that's one of the things I've kind of been watching, but whether you're allowed to deduct your income or your property taxes in, I forget what they call that, but right now it's the Democratic states that usually have that issue, and I know they had talked about going after that in the early go round, and I don't know if it's in this bill or this proposal that he has to maintain that deductibility.
Madam Chair, Sasha Bergman from our staff has done some work on this issue, and I can also add.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Council Member Sasha Bergman with the IGR Department. As I understand it, that was not in our previous federal agenda, and it's not in this version. Certainly something the council could entertain adding if you were interested in it. I do have some information from, not in front of me, but I could get it to you from, I want to say it's the National League of Cities, but it talks about how different states or all the states are impacted by the deductibility of state and local taxes. I think Minnesota is in the top 10.
I think you're right.
Yeah. I think Congressional District 5 is in the middle in terms of the congressional districts in the state. But I'm happy to, and I want to say it generally hovers around 30% of taxpayers or tax filers are
Mhm.
impacted by it.
Mhm.
So,
Okay.
and
I'd
I would
just be
add that,
interested in a little more information about it. That
yeah, and I would add that my understanding is that the majority of taxpayers don't itemize and so wouldn't take advantage of that
Right.
if they don't, have
Right.
deductions besides the standard deduction.
Yep.
So,
Okay.
yeah,
Thanks.
we can follow up with more
Okay.
information.
Thanks.
Is there anything more, Mr. Ranieri or Mr. Ebnet? Just want to make sure we've heard all you'd like us to hear. I think that means no. Backing away. So we have in front of us the federal agenda for 2017. I'll go ahead and move it and see if anybody would like to discuss any portions of it. And I'm not seeing anyone. I just want to say a big thank you to staff. I know Peter Ebnet put in a tremendous amount of work, but also supported by kind of a broad array of staff members who do a lot of work on the federal pieces, whether it's work managing the grants or monitoring different funds that come into the city, or just generally trying to stay on top of what has seemed like just a pounding of information and trying to suss out what is sort of preliminary, I don't know what you call it, feeling out of what may be a reaction to a proposal that actually isn't yet a proposal compared with, what may be the current administration's actual budget put on paper and moving through the process and things like that. So I know that takes a tremendous amount of work to try to do that. And while we have federal lobbyists, they're not there for every single little question we may have, just to be blunt. So there was a lot of reframing that went into this agenda. Again, just to be careful in thinking about, we kind of have a new context for thinking about our federal work where we need to be just very careful about saying, what is our proactive agenda for the city of Minneapolis that benefits all of our residents? Because I think we can kind of get into reactive mode of things that are not part of what is our broader proactive agenda. And so we kind of have a marrying of those two things. What are the things that we feel are actual proposals that we need to be clear on our opposition for, support for, versus the things that are part of our proactive agenda we want to, what we want the world to be like. So again, thank you for doing a lot of that work to create this document and a good roadmap. That's really for our staff that works on this and our federal lobbyists to kind of have a clearer picture of what we would like the focus to be. So with that, I believe I don't see any questions. So on approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, and that item is approved. Mr. Ranieri, it seemed like you might have a few updates you wanted to share with us, verbal updates, or Ms. Bergman.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Sasha Bergman with the IGR Department. Just wanted to provide a brief update on the goings-on of the legislature and the governor. I think maybe the last time we updated you might have been in June when there was some back and forth. The governor had signed all of the bills but had objected to some provisions in the tax bill that he had signed. The legislature had put a provision in the state government finance bill to unfund the Department of Revenue if the tax bill was not signed. And then the governor line item vetoed the legislature's funding. Where that ended up, I think our last update was probably that the legislature took the governor to court on that matter and said that he doesn't have the right to constitutional right to unfund a co-equal branch of government. The governor, though, does have the ability to line item veto funding, appropriations. That's part of his constitutional abilities. So the Ramsey County Court sided with the legislature. The governor appealed to the Supreme Court of the state, and they ruled that the governor does have the ability to line item funding, their funding, but ordered the two parties to mediation to work out their differences. There was a day and a half of mediation, I believe, at the end of last week, and then the mediator said that the two parties were at an impasse. So still unclear exactly what the next steps are. We've learned that the legislature evidently has enough funding to get it through February, I believe, which is when the regular session will start, February 20th. And I'm not sure if the the Supreme Court will have any further action at this point. I know by September 30th, which is in 2 days, I believe the two parties were supposed to come back to the court and share the status of their mediation, which we now know is at an impasse. So more to come, but just a quick update of the goings on in the last couple of months. And then also just a note on our internal legislative agenda process. We have solicited ideas from our departments through our policy liaison team. Those proposals continue to move forward. Next week, the policy liaison team will meet and make some of their recommendations based on the proposals, and we will be reaching out to each of your offices to make sure you're briefed on what those proposals are and anticipate there will be at least a couple presentations to the IGR committee of those presentations either at the October 12th or 26th meeting. And then from there, hope to have a updated legislative policy position document going into 2018, as well as a shorter 2018 legislative agenda. And again, we'll be reaching out to you, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
All right. Not seeing questions from my colleagues.
Thank you.
But I appreciate the update.
Yep.
Mr. Ranieri?
Madam Chair, in October, we will be bringing in not only the legislative program, but also something new that we've developed, Metropolitan Council policies, and that should be ready within the next cycle or the cycle after.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, with that, I see we've concluded with our business for today. Thank you to everyone, and we are adjourned.